All right, welcome to another somber episode of this podcast. I'm not sure you've seen it in the news. Daniel C. Dennett has died, one of the most influential philosophers this generation. He turned 82, I think, in 2023, and he died last week. Um, we had him as the first guest of this podcast to launch this podcast. Um, and yeah, it was nice to see an outpouring of love for Dennett all across the internet, philosophical circles, Facebook, Twitter, and the like, with many telling about fantastic stories of how Dennett has helped them. Now, who is Dennett? He's a major philosopher of mind, a cognitive scientist. He's been very influential in getting a science of consciousness off the ground. He's written on free will, on Darwin. He's defended evolution. Many will know him as one of the four horsemen of new atheism, alongside Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens. And he has had a stellar career. Um, and I wrote a nice little tribute for Dennett on Psychology Today. Let me just share that here. There we go. I hope you can all see that. Perhaps I read that just out and give some comments. Um, Tribute to a philosophical giant, personal reflections on the scholarship, kindness of Dan Dennett. So, one of the most influential philosophers and cognitive scientists, Daniel C. Dennett, passed away this week. He was one of the first contemporary philosophers to take naturalism really seriously. That is, the idea that philosophy and science should be continuous with each other and that science is our best guide to understand the nature of reality. He was quite influenced by Quine, who I believe, attended an undergrad lecture of at Harvard. And initially, he was a bit opposed to Quine. He tried to find a way to debunk him, to find an alternative way. But then, during his PhD, he eventually became one of the most Quinean philosophers, and took really seriously the idea that in order to understand the mind, we need to look at the mind sciences, cognitive neuroscience, biology, psychology, and the like. So he engaged closely with the sciences to address fundamental philosophical questions such as what is the mind and do we have free will, at a time when philosophers of mind largely regarded the field as wholly distinct from psychology and neurosciences. And Dennett instead submitted his doctoral dissertation in Oxford, 1965, arguing that the mind is the brain and urging philosophers to take the sciences of the mind seriously. His naturalistic attitude has now become widespread in philosophy, even though it was once questioned. Dennett was not interested in drawing stark disciplinary boundaries. Instead, he sought to learn from many scientists, to synthesize the results, to make progress in our understanding of nature. He saw himself as a disciple. He really tried to learn from as many scientists as possible, and make progress on these deep, old, long-standing philosophical problems. So Dennett became a pioneer in cognitive science and artificial intelligence, where he deeply influenced many researchers, myself included, in philosophy. And he's well known, I mentioned, for defending Darwinism against its religious critics, and he reached wide audiences as a member of the so-called Four Horsemen, as I said already, of New Atheism, alongside Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and the late Christopher Hitchens, where he pointed out the flaws in religious thinking, why we shouldn't give religion undue respect. We should examine it as a natural phenomenon that evolved, and develop perhaps a more rational understanding of this human need for deeper meaning, spirituality, and the like. And he was a little bit less, perhaps, um, aggressive, you might call it, than Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens. But he was fundamentally opposed to religion as having much influence in our lives. Instead, he took a naturalist attitude. We should understand nature with the tools of science. We shouldn't embrace a kind of mysticism, uh, but really take nature seriously as what it is, something that is investigatable by the uses of our mind, by the tools of science, without there being a need to postulate mysterious entities. So then it's sought to answer why questions of philosophy that many thought they can't be answered by science, by understanding how we got there. I mentioned you wanted to understand how religion, for instance, evolved. How did evolution give us free will? How did consciousness evolve? How does cultural evolution give rise to religion? He was inspired by Wilfrid Sellars' dictum to for philosophy to understand how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. Indeed, Dennett might be described as one of the great philosophers. Unlike most contemporary philosophers, he built a systematic philosophy, very similar to philosophers in the past like Kant, um, Aristotle, and the like, of us and our place in the world on thoroughly Darwinian grounds. He really embraced the importance of Darwin for philosophy, that many of the concepts we think about appear very different once we think about them from an evolutionary perspective. And beyond his philosophical and scientific contributions, Dan is also remembered for his kindness and mentorship to young scholars inside and outside of Tufts University, whereas many philosophers or academics more generally restrict themselves to students in their own university, right? So I said the last few days have seen an outpouring of love for him with numerous stories of how Dan supported him over the years. And luckily, I myself was one of them and have been connected with Dan since 2018. Below, I will tell some anecdotes. Here's on the left, for those who only listen to the audio version of this podcast, a picture of me and Dennett, who I met first in 2018 as an undergrad at the Generalized Theory of Evolution conference. He came to Germany back then to present a plenary lecture at the Düsseldorf Center for Logic and Philosophy of Science. And yeah, at the time I was an undergrad who had organized a reading group on his influential book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, a year earlier in Barrett. So I was excited to see him speak in person. He's very much inspired me to think of philosophy in this naturalist way, an alternative approach to analytic philosophy or continental philosophy, but really think through philosophy through the means of science as an alternative way of doing philosophy. Yeah, I was excited to hear him speak, and after his talk, he was happy to sign books and take pictures with attendees, showcasing his celebrity status among philosophers, scientists, and members of the general public. I didn't even think of bringing a book along to get it signed, unfortunately. So I was surprised at how forthcoming and happy to chat he was with an undergrad from Germany. That you can't always expect that from senior figures or stars like him in general. And yeah, influenced by him, I went on to pursue an MA in the philosophy of biological and cognitive sciences at the University of Bristol, which was a very unique master program. It seemed like the perfect program to prepare me to do the kind of naturalistic philosophy that Dennett advocated. Later organized a commentary for the Journal of Behavioral and Brain Sciences during the degree, and couldn't believe that Dan himself agreed to co-author it, mostly group of junior authors. That was very exciting, right? How old was I? Well, it was a couple of years ago, in a sense, prior to starting my PhD. When did it come out? I think it was 2020. Yeah, oh, no, maybe early in 2019. Yeah, and well, to me that was incredible. I mean, I admired Dennett, and now I had a paper with, even if it was just a small commentary. Um, and yeah, I continued on to pursue a PhD at the University of Sydney on the evolution of consciousness, and to my surprise, here again, Dennett was willing to provide me with encouraging feedback. I mean, every PhD student struggles at time with their progress and confidence in whether what they have written is meaningful. So having one of your intellectual heroes provide you with useful suggestions, feedback that they agree with, and the like, and like what you have written was incredibly confidence boosting, right? I mean, if Dennett likes what you have written, well, I guess you can have some confidence. You don't have to be too worried, perhaps. And yeah, later I also wrote a paper on the similarities between Dennett and Spinoza during my PhD. Um, yeah, I wrote a bunch of papers unrelated to the PhD. A bit of getting sidetracked there. I can't recommend that too much. Um, but yeah, he greatly enjoyed that paper. Uploaded his to his website and shared on social media. He was very excited about that. That there's some proto-Dennettian ideas, you could say, in Spinoza of similar ideas to Dennett's free-floating rationales, that they are out there in nature and can be, in a sense, discovered by natural selection or humans in their ingenuity. Um, but yeah, I mean, this was not all. When I entered the job market, perhaps the most important thing here was that Dan helped me to apply for jobs by providing me with reference letters. And typically, academics only write letters for students from their own institutions. Um, so I was again surprised at Dan's kindness to take the time and write letters to the many institutions I applied for. Uh, Luckily, I was only on the job market for like a year before I landed a permanent position. Um, yeah, I'm very thankful for Dan here. Maybe I wouldn't have the job. Who knows? Yeah, I mean, Dan was an incredibly kind person. I very much encourage you to look out all the tributes that have been posted on other websites of people retelling how Dan has helped them over the years, and it's incredible how helpful he was to many junior scholars. Gave them confidence, tips, and the like, and loved to talk to them. He wasn't just restricting himself to talk to other senior scholars, not at all. I think that's quite incredible. And he was very interested in cultural evolution, of course. So Eric Schlieser, for instance, noted that part of Dan's motivation probably was to spread himself in this cultural way of getting his memes out there, of influencing people. But then on the other hand, Dan was never someone who was really hard trying to convince other people necessarily of his ideas in a dogmatic way to indoctrinate them. No, not at all. He was very much keen on hearing disagreements, improve his own views. Um, and I think we can speak very much yeah, highly in favor of this approach of doing philosophy. So to have some closing words here. In December 2023, I recorded an interview with Dan on his autobiography to launch my podcast. One of the last interviews he did, and let me end this personal remembrance with some personal guidance he gave in his interviews to young would-be philosophers. So I asked, do you have any advice for young philosophers on how they should approach the field now? Should they focus on AI research with a little bit of a discussion before that on AI and its threat to modern society? And then it responded, well, everybody should focus on it to some degree. I think it's a very important issue because it's immediate. We're not talking about who cares about the singularity in 100 years or 20 years or 500 years. Right now, the dangers are there, and we've created these new artificial meme systems, which can evolve and it could set off an epidemic or pandemic that we want to avoid at all costs. And he largely meant the dangers of undermining truth, where you can just create fake images, fake texts, and the like, which undermine the trust between people in society. And his advice was for students was the same as he said to students at Tufts. If you think you have a really good idea, blurt it out, and you have something to fix. It may be wrong, but at least you've got something to study, to fix, to criticize, to get help with, and always get help from others. Um, So, I think to me, then it was an idol. I was a fan in a sense. I didn't agree with everything. There's plenty of disagreements between us, but the way of doing philosophy, of really studying the natural world seriously and try to connect that um, with our understanding of our sort of folk ontology of how we understand the world, how we talk to each other, that really um, got closer to Wilfrid Seller's dictum of our philosophy to understand how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term more than any other philosopher. I think he really developed a system there for making sense of all these things, right? A lot of things are mysterious, perhaps thinking of free will, consciousness, and the like. And these old philosophical questions might suggest that it can't be answered by science, but then really showed that we actually don't understand a lot of what comes out of the sciences. And we need to appreciate how much progress we have made and how much understanding we actually have once we synthesize all this empirical data. Um, Now, there might still be a lot of puzzles out there to solve, but we are making rapid progress in our understanding of the mind, and that should be very much appreciated. And similarly, I mean, my book on animal consciousness, how we can develop a science there, was an attempt to, in a sense, continue Dennett's project, but unlock the secrets of the mind, not just for humans, but also more generally for the evolutionary origins of mind, which he had a great interest in. So, yeah, I hope you enjoyed this small special episode of this podcast. And yeah, I'd encourage you to read a lot of Dan's writing, listen to the probably over hundreds of interviews you can find of him on YouTube. He was a great philosopher. And yeah, philosophy has lost a giant. Anyway, um, I'll stop sharing here. Thanks for listening to this episode. Uh, think of subscribing if you want to see other episodes, other interviews, hear me talk about some of my research. And yeah, have a good week.